had the opportunity to meet Dr. Woodard while he was working at Colonial Williamsburg, and he worked on the American Indian Initiative there. So if any of you have had the fortune, here comes our train, y'all. And the light switches, hey, it's a good time. It falls in line with, you know, the museum's haunted, I'll tell you that story. At the end of the day, we can chalk it up to the ghost. Yeah, it is. So, Buck did a phenomenal job with the programming at Colonial Williamsburg to tell the native story at Williamsburg. And I know many of us, because we've talked about it personally, have gone to Williamsburg. Raise your hand if you actually got to see some of the American Indian programming that was done there. Very, very well done. So that was some of his handiwork, that was part of his research and his dedicated to telling that colonial story. So I'm going to read his official bio here. Buck Woodard is a professorial lecturer in the Department of Anthropology at the American University in Washington, D.C. He earned his MA and PhD from the College of William and Mary, not too shabby. He is a cultural anthropologist specializing in historical and applied research with many primary focuses on the ethnohistory and ethnology of indigenous peoples in North America. And this is especially true for in Virginia and the Carolinas. So I could go on and on, but I will let Dr. Woodard come up and give his presentation, and we are delighted to have him. Let's welcome Dr. Buck Woodard.
Thank you, Nancy. I am very pleased to be here at UNCP, and thank you, Nancy, for the invitation and allowing this program to move forward, and I hope I can add a little bit to the discussion today. I am an anthropologist, I'm not a historian, so I regret that I will probably not be as eloquent and smooth in my delivery of text as Dr. Lowry. A very beautiful presentation, very passionate. I do have content to share with you, less of a textual nature and more of a thematic nature, and I hope that it will engender some discussion and some questions that we may take from this presentation time here, but maybe a little bit later as well. When Nancy and I were chatting about the project and program, she was very much interested in looking at how we might situate historical, genealogical narratives within a broader context, and thinking about the importance of boundaries and borders. I was outside a few minutes ago talking with another participant, and she said, so you're going to be talking about boundaries and borders like geography? And I said, yes, to a degree, borders and geography, but also we might think about borders of those that are free and those that are enslaved. We may consider boundaries and borders of people who are independent nations and then become tributaries of the crown. Borders that may revolve around moving across spaces, language, culture, and history together. So I'm offering up some maps for your consideration, as well as some bullets and some text in a thematic way. So let's see if we can take a little bit of a moment to consider 4 topics that we'd like to cover in the short time we have. I think maybe 30 minutes or so, is that the plan? You want to, what time do you want to end? About 12?
You want
10?
to end, yeah, right around noon would be great.
Okay. I want to introduce, if you're not familiar with
5 or 10 minutes.
5 or
That's
10
fine.
minutes? Okay.
You cut it your time.
The colonial tributary system. This is a system that's not well understood even among historians, but it's very important for understanding the communities that came out of the colonial period and their relationship to the British Crown as tributaries of the Crown. And what does that status mean? Think about the character of labor in Virginia during the 17th century into the 18th century. Our ideas about indentured servitude and slavery are sometimes framed more from a later period, say the 19th century, the antebellum period. We don't often consider how uneven, messy, and different the period of the 17th century during that formative time when really concepts of race were not solidified and there was great fluidity among peoples from the continents of Africa, North America, and Europe. And then an area that I was surprised when I began research years ago to find that the fur trade has such an important story, or important part of the story here in the East. The fur trade was something I always associated with maybe the the Great Lakes for the beaver, and maybe somewhere in the Rocky Mountains, fur traders. It didn't sound like a Virginia, Carolina story about how important the fur trade and really the deerskin trade in this region played in the choices that people made and the ways in which they operated within an emerging colonial economy. And then to think about frontiers, and what is a frontier, and how does a frontier get formed, and what kind of characteristics there might be of a frontier. The frontier never stays in one place, it's always moving. It's in for a period of time, it's in a location, but it's always moving in some direction. We still have a few frontiers left today on the planet, but frontiers are a very dynamic space where there's lots of interaction of different kinds of peoples, and different rules apply to a frontier. They aren't the same as maybe in an urban center, so for us to consider a frontier dynamic. I want to start by talking about a tributary status. You probably are more familiar, or may be familiar with the peoples where Jamestown was first founded, the Powhatan peoples. These are Pocahontas' peoples. Dr. Lowry mentioned her earlier as a narrative that some Americans know. But in the beginning, the Powhatan polity, we might think of it as a chiefdom. It's independent, it has an internal government, it has a population of 15,000 individuals, give or take. But it hadn't been there for a long period of time. Actually, the Powhatan chiefdom was formed probably between 1560 or so, 65, and kind of it reached its apex at about 1610, right at the eve of colonization and through periods of colonization. I don't know if we have a pointer. Well, you can sort of see the beginning of the Powhatan chiefdom as this crescent that's right around here, and then expanded down the tidewater to its largest extent in 1610. But through colonization and the warfare of the 16-teens and then the 1620s and the 1640s, the English planted a colony in Virginia and brought much of what was originally the Powhatan Territory under English control. So that gray area in the middle of what is the James River Valley became under English control by the 1640s. And then this red crescent was sort of what remained of the Powhatan Territories. Many other native communities, you can see a little faint four off to one side and a little ephemeral to the bottom. These are Algonquian-speaking peoples, but there are Iroquoians and Siouan-speaking peoples in this landscape as well. I'm just focusing on the Powhatan in red there specifically. But this was the time in which the Powhatan first entered into a treaty, a formal document, an agreement with the English. It set out the responsibilities and rights of both parties, but a process that was brought to the Americas from Europe was that after a war was concluded, many times the kings of Europe would create a little brother or a tributary type of category whereby the defeated group could still retain control over their people and still could maintain control over some territory, particularly within their own boundaries. They could govern their own communities and have their own internal rules. They were allowed to survive in a diminished status, but it became an important status because when warfare would again come, not between the two previously opposing groups, but maybe an outside force, the kings could call upon tributaries to act as mercenaries and armies for them in the future. So this was coming out of feudal Europe, and it was brought to the Americas during the late medieval period. So they continued a diplomatic and political process from Europe and brought it here. So when making a treaty, the kings and queens, as they were called, this is what the English thought of native leaders. They called them kings and queens from their own orientation. But they would say that you agree to carry your title at the sort of the pleasure of the English king. You are a chief, or you are a king or a queen because the English king has allowed you to remain in control of your territory. This tributary status first started in the 1640s, and the group that took on that first tributary role was now called the Pamunkey, and they signed as the king of all the Indians of this particular area. So they became tributaries, and they agreed that their tributary relationship came from the King of England, who was not necessarily in control over them inside their territory, but now was a dominant power, and they had a relationship with them that was built around this treaty relationship. A series of wars also erupted in the 1670s, at which time the Pamunkey position was reaffirmed by the English king after a period we call Bacon's Rebellion in Virginia. The Queen of Pamunkey, as she was called then, was identified as being the leader of the remnants of the Powhatan chiefdom, and she signed on behalf of herself and several other nations, as it was said in the treaty. Meaning, in some ways, the Queen of Pamunkey was acting a little bit like one of the European monarchs, that she had smaller tributaries or groups underneath of her. Other communities signed the 1677 Treaty of Middle Plantation, also called the Articles of Peace, to include communities on the south side of the James River, the Weyanoke. We heard earlier a little bit about the Nottoway and the Nansemond. This is a cover of that document, and it was seen to be so important by the Crown that they printed it in London and distributed it throughout England as well as in Virginia, that outlined what were the mutual responsibilities of the English and the natives in the colony of Virginia. And they extended types of materials to those leadership figures, such as this, what we call a frontlet. It's a large cartouche that's in silver that was given to the Queen of Pamunkey. And importantly, I think, for our consideration of the way Europe or England viewed this territory at that point in time, it situated Virginia not as full of white people, but Virginians as being native peoples. But it put Virginia as a native space in a catalog of other tributaries of the Crown. So the English king had dominion over Ireland, over Scotland, over England, over part of France at that point in time, and over Virginia. So that's why Virginia is known as the Old Dominion, because it was this other tributary status that was established with territories in Europe as well as North America. You know, could it have gone differently? We don't know. It's not a foregone conclusion at this point, but I will offer that there have been recent referendums from Scotland and Ireland about whether they wish to remain within the United Kingdom. If the story had gone differently, possibly Virginians would be voting from an indigenous place whether they wish to remain under the English crown. So some of these stories weren't completely worked out by this point in time, but it's important, I think, to recognize the diplomacy and engagement that was emerging at that point. By 1680, you can see that the map is quite different, and the native territory pretty much retained only in an area that we today call Pamunkey Neck. And then south of the English-controlled territories, there are native lands in sort of gray and green. And there are a few, I should mention, what begins to form the American system of reservations at this point in time. So you probably don't know these stories, but this is kind of a large reservation. There are several other ones on the northern neck, some that are in Maryland, some along the eastern shore that are here, but all of this land remains under indigenous control. Reservations weren't started to keep Indians in. They were organized around where native peoples could not go. So the English said, this is our reserved land, and you stay in your land, and if you wish to come inside our land, you have to have a pass, you have to have permission, etc. So creating a boundary not to keep people in, but rather to keep people out, which is a very English. If you've been to England, you know it's a country of little walls and little permissions to get inside further and further spaces, such as a castle or something along those lines. Coming out of the tributary system, one might ask, you know, why was our tributary relationship seen to be important? And during the preceding years after 1677, a second treaty was signed in 1680 that included dozens of other native communities who saw the relationship as a good one, particularly for protection against other indigenous communities, prominently the Iroquois, the Five Nations of the North, and some communities that were associated with the French, such as the Shawnee, who were raiding and coming into the territory of Virginia at the time. By being a tributary of England, natives could call upon the protection of the militia and other English forces, and we see a couple of incidents in the historic record where native peoples in England and Englishmen are fighting alongside each other with foreign or strange Indians, as they were called in the record, coming into the area. So other groups signed on to this arrangement, the Saponi, the Manikin, we could put the Meharin into this list. The Susquehanna communities had come into Virginia at this point in time and probably signed alongside some of those individuals. The Appomattox attempted to make an alliance. And the 1680 version also included all of the natives of Maryland. So they weren't specifically named, but it's a broad native policy, a broad English policy in dealing with native peoples. And I've put a few of the list. I'll just read them for you. Tributaries to Virginia at the end of the 18th century who were in this type of relationship from the Algonquian speakers included the Pamunkey, the Mattaponi, Chickahominy, who were settled together in one town, the Rappahannock, Nanzatico, Portabago, who were also settled in a settlement together, the Nansemond and Weyanoke, who were closely allied, the Appomattox or Powhite, Gangaskin or Accomack, Oconomowoc, who were on the eastern shore. From the Iroquoians, we've heard about the Tuscarora, the Nottoway, the Meherrin, refugees, Susquehannocks and Conestogas who had come down from the areas around Maryland. And then from the Siouan speakers, the Siphoni and the Totaro or Tutelo, and possibly combined with them the Occaneechi and the Manikin. So quite a number of native communities saw this as an advantageous alliance even after the beginning of colonialism. But these rights and responsibilities of this treaty positioned many of these communities to be very close to the colonials and to have regular interaction with the colonials. But it was not a status that had to be maintained year in, year out. Some groups left the region, such as the Siphoni, moved into Carolina, and later came back 20 years later and said, we'd like to be tributary again and enter into a new treaty relationship. So it was a status that could be turned on and turned off as native peoples were interested, but it was very much linked to lands and responsibilities about tribute, about offering tribute annually to show that they were allied. When the Tuscarora took place, it was Virginia that said, we need to call upon our tributaries to protect the borders of Virginia during this time of war. So communities made choices about siding with Virginia during the Tuscarora War to include some northern Tuscarora towns, the Nottoway, some Siphoni, etc. So the map that you see here doesn't mean that all the gray area is not inhabited by native people. It just shows concentrations of some of these communities. The Algonquian speakers are mostly in the blue. The very large orange glob are the Iroquoian territories of Tuscarora. Some Siouan speakers through the Piedmont, of course the Cherokee farther to the west. This is an archaeological map produced by UNC Chapel Hill, but it gives us a sense of the diversity, even at the end of the 17th century, of how many native communities are in this Carolina-Virginia border country. Moving out of tributary content about labor in Virginia, I think this is an area that, if you're interested in research, really needs attention and consideration, because it's not. The terms servant and slave weren't always lifelong categories in status, for instance, and they didn't always mean, when we say the word slave, doesn't always mean black or African American. Indentured servants had multiple terms of service when they first came. You may know that 4 years was like the beginning type of term that someone might sign on to. They were brought from Europe to America for labor specifically. They had to give 4 years, and if they did, they would be free afterwards, and they would then therefore enter into the society as a free person, able to own property, etc. The problem with the Irish and the Welsh and poor English and Scottish is they were living through their indentures and becoming property owners and becoming competitive with Englishmen who were developing plantations in Virginia during the 17th century, and so they upped the indenture to 7 years, so they could keep people in service a bit longer. Tracking the backgrounds of these servants, they're multiple. They come from many different European communities, but we also see that there's indentures that are made for native peoples. Tributaries who are living close to the English, who want to, because they're engaged with the colonials in making documents, for instance, like treaties, see some utility in having some of their people raised up in the English way. And this has been going on since the very first years of Jamestown. They would indenture sometimes young native people into an English home for a term to be reared in the English tradition, to learn the language, to learn to read and write, to be dressed in the English fashion, maybe to learn Christianity. And then after the term was over, they could return to their community, but when they did, they could navigate more fully the English society that surrounded them and act as advocates, possibly translators, or middlemen or middlewomen in some cases for their communities. Oftentimes, though, things happen in life. People who were indentured weren't always returned, and people who had agreements that weren't always kept. Some people stayed in servitude for longer than the agreement. There were also Africans in this category, and not all Africans that came in the first years of the Virginia colony were enslaved for life. We have multiple examples of Africans who were indentured for a term period and then also became free. So just to say that there are multiple types of peoples in the indentured servant category. And when reading records, working with other tribes, sometimes they say, you know, we think they're native, but they sure look white in the paperwork because they're doing these white things. They put air quotes, I put air quotes around white. In the period, some of these terms weren't even in use, but they're acting as participants in the colonial economy. They're making documents. They are getting leases or buying land or showing up somewhere to be paid for some kind of service, or they're suing somebody, or there's a problem in court. Because they're acting in these bureaucratic ways, sometimes people see them as a certain race when there's no race even identified. So we have to be, I think, considerate of the diversity of peoples in some of these categories, such as servant. Servant versus slave, they even called slaves who were indentured, they called them slaves sometimes in the record. So just when a person's called a slave doesn't always mean that's a lifelong category. Sometimes they're freed when they're 25, sometimes they're freed when they're 30. Life expectancy is not long during this period, so it could also be that you're a servant for life, which is basically a slave. So I think there's some consideration about servant versus slave. It becomes more fully a lifelong servitude by the end of the 17th century, but through the mid-17th century, this is not as defined. You can really watch the change in labor by looking at the legal code in Virginia. So tracking the labor laws in, say, Henning statutes or the House of Burgesses, and what rules and laws are made speak to a situation already happening. Laws aren't created for something that hasn't happened. Laws are created for things that already have happened, and the government seems to need to reconcile or correct something. For instance, condition of the mother law in the early 1660s, that law stated that whatever the status of the mother will be the status of the child. Why was this law created? Well, when you put peoples of different backgrounds together in labor, working long periods of time together, many years, they tend to make new people. And new people were made, and the owners of the indentures would say, well, how can I be compensated for the 12 months, the 9 months of this pregnancy, the 18 months of rearing the child and weaning, maybe 2 years of slowdown in work. I've lost 2 years of my 4 years, or my 7 years, and I want compensation for this pregnancy taking place. I can fine the indentured servant, but how's that servant going to pay the thousands of pounds of tobacco? So they created laws that said, well, one way we can reconcile it is the child that's born will also be a servant, and then that status is conferred from mother to child. So the status of the child is conferred from the mother. And I think you could quickly see how this is modified through 80 or 100 years to become what we know today as race. That is, the race of the individual is then transferred to the next generation, regardless of who the parents may be. But these new laws that came up about the condition of the mother in servitude would place term services, sometimes 15 years, 25 years, on children of those unions. And so it's an interesting thing to consider that with all the diversity of the peoples in indentured servitude and enslaved categories, that we have new types of things that were not expected. For instance, in the documentary record in Virginia, we have native plantation owners that have owned property, act like Europeans, and they buy indentures from Ireland to come over and work their plantations. So there's an American Indian man, his name's Ned Gunstocker. He has a will, he has a list of goods from his household. He was purchasing labor from Europe as well as from locally working his plantation. We can look to an African man who was baptized by the Spanish, had a Spanish name. His name was Antonio, his wife's name was Maria. They were both of African descent, and they were free during the mid-17th century, had their own plantation that their grandchildren called Angola, and they purchased their own slaves as well as servants. They created laws in the late 17th century that said, we're going to change the nature of this servitude so that Indians and Africans can only purchase members of their own nation or their own kind. so that no more whites can be, as they were beginning to be called, can be purchased by Africans and Indians to work land. That there began to become categories that we now call race being defined. But for a brief period of time, there were multiple Europeans, Africans, and natives working within this colonial society as competitors for both land, labor, etc. So that's something I think interesting for us to consider as you look at late 17th century documents. And think about that the status of an individual was not race within colonial society, but rather free or in service. So being a free person was an important category, but you can see that color of an individual becomes to be more discussed. And so being a free person of color really reflects that you're not an indentured or a person in service who could possibly be of color, but saying they're a free man. Being a free man was also applied to Europeans. So in the late 17th century, these categories of freedom are very much more important than the identity that we may think of as race, at least in the record. But it speaks to a stratified society inside the colonial boundaries, where people who have access to resources and people that do not. I'm going to go through some of these quickly in the interest of time. Maybe we can get some questions, and Dr. Lowry was right. Professors, when they get up, they either are arguing or they give a lecture. I'll see if I can push through some of this. This is a cartouche from a map in Virginia, Carolina, about 1715, and it shows a merchant, an Indian trader, working with native peoples who are bringing in skins and furs, and he's offering the mercantile goods of Europe in exchange for those skins and furs. That was the backbone of the Indian trade. Skins, furs, as well as slaves. We'll speak about that a little bit in just a moment. But I want to also point out that there's a European ancestor is the merchant that appears to be an African individual acting as his manservant or his assistant, and then native people. So even in this early 18th century document, you see the three continents sort of working together in different capacities and in different ways. And of course, when they work closely, they make new peoples. This map is confusing because it's a map of Virginia, Carolina, but does not look like the maps that we know today. This is the Hahnemann map, and you'll see that cartouche is over there on the side. But I want you to think about boundaries in the sense of these were Europeans creating maps, and if they didn't know what the boundaries of the colonies were, you can imagine how confusing it could be for the indigenous population to consider whether or not I'm in Carolina or in Virginia when I call this territory something completely different. This may be, the indigenous name for a space, but this map shows Virginia claiming Raleigh, North Carolina, and Carolina claiming up into Brunswick County, Virginia. And that Maryland doesn't even have that leg that sticks out at the time. So an interesting map to consider that boundaries change. And when people talk with me about, doing Virginia history, I think sometimes you have to think about when in Virginia. There's an old quote from William Byrd. He said, in the beginning, all of America was Virginia, at least in the English minds. So we say Virginia Indians, but that's really contemporary Virginia Indians, not native peoples of the Ohio or West Virginia or Kentucky when it used to be a county. This map is a great one for researchers. It's the Moseley map from 1733 of Carolina. It has lots of different communities on here. We can go into a little bit more detail. I want to point to the line that kind of cuts across the top there. That's a trading path that is documented. But this includes the territory that you're interested in, as well as some of the native communities that are on and labeled on the map. Some here from the Nansemond Indians are considered to be mostly Virginia Indians, but they were in Carolina, territory of Carolina. The Meharan, who are Iroquoian-speaking peoples, Chowan, Yapim, also called Weapamock, and Potoskete, who are also Algonquian speakers there along the northern banks of the Albemarle. People sometimes are surprised to know how many native communities there are in the colonial period, even after the frontiers moved mostly to the west by this point in time. Here are some of the Tuscarora towns. And this map documents that the Tuscarora War is taking place already and that many groups have retreated either south to the west or to the north. This part of the country was formerly inhabited by the Tuscarora Indians, and it includes documentation about where the forts were located, but also that a remnant of Tuscaroras remained at Indian Woods, and that a Saponi town, Chiu, was just on the outside of that Tuscarora town. And that remained as a Tuscarora, eventually, reservation until the 19th century. here's that trading path that cuts through there that says it's the Indian trading road from the Catawbas and Cherokee Indians to Virginia. And I think it's important to note here that the boundary and the frontier is pushed very much to the west by the 18th century, and that the colonies are engaging natives who are farther away from the colonial boundaries. So we hear less and less in the documentary record about those Pamunkeys, the Chowans, Meharans, those that were the first tributaries, and we hear much more about Cherokees and Catawbas and Delawares and Senecas and Cayugas and those that are farther away from the colony. So it marks a shift in that frontier as it moved west, but it also points to the long distances that traders were traveling of European, Native, and African ancestry deep into the interior, and new relationships that were being made with communities that were farther away, while maintaining some relationships to communities that were closer to the colonies. This is a map from a bit later, 1755. It's called the Jefferson Frey Map. Thomas Jefferson's father is the cartographer. I'm interested in it because this cartouche talks to a shift. The previous cartouche talked about more of a frontier dynamic where we have trade between natives who are in control of territories and Europeans who are bringing finished manufactured goods. This map sort of creates the imagery and ideology that the place has been settled, it's been colonized, and now is a regular and refined export of goods that are made in the colony for exportation back to the motherland in the form of tobacco. And in some cases, these hogsheads also contain beaver skins. But you see the ordered society no longer talks about partnership, but Africans in complete servitude and Europeans in the complete positions of power. So I like comparing and looking at these two cartouches and the way that Europeans thought about the landscape that do signal some changes in boundaries and frontiers, and the types of relationships that are increasingly stratified and rigid within the colony, but outside of the colony, we could see that when they were much more fluid and dynamic, with people having more agency. Another part of the map that's interesting is that the trade path still exists by the time of the French and Indian War to the James River warehouses. So those warehouses export both tobacco as well as skins and furs. And I did something I think kind of clever. I could take the two maps and put them together, and you can see the Indian trading path that goes from basically what is Petersburg or the Northern James River deep into Indian territory and beyond, as late as the 1760s. That's a time when most of the narrative shifts inside the colony to be about no longer peoples from different societies in contact with one another, but rather different peoples inside the same society. So it's kind of a different orientation. So instead of having a contact of different peoples coming together in more equality or negotiation, it talks about those different peoples being inside one society, and therefore it has to be stratified in some way because of the system's dynamics. Native perceptions of the territory. These we've seen European ones. This is a rare native perspective on the territory that we've just looked at from Virginia, Carolina. This is called the Catawba Map from 1721. Originally on a deerskin and painted. Native conceptions of the space are all in circles, and they make the Europeans in squares, which I find to be an interesting cognition for us to think about circles and squares. The orientation may be difficult to see, but I'll turn it in just a moment so you can see how the orientation goes. But they identify Virginia as being one partner in this exchange, and Charleston specifically, not really Carolina, but Charleston specifically as being the other partner. And at this point in time, the Indian trade had shifted heavily towards Charleston, and so it's much larger on the map. In Virginia, the entire colony is much smaller. But the communities in the middle are mostly in alliance with the Catawba, the multiple nations of the Catawba. If we shift the orientation, you can see this map here from Robin Beck puts Virginia up at the top. You can see the faint outline of some of the states of Mississippi and Georgia and so forth. People also maybe misunderstand the proximity of some of these communities. On the map is also included the Chickasaw, the Cherokees, who were quite far away, but they were known to be trading partners and allies like the Catawba were with Carolina and Virginia. Who's not on the map? Well, there's some pretty big omissions. including all the Muskogean speakers, called Creeks, Upper and Lower Creeks, who were seen to be enemies of the individuals on the map. So they weren't put on the map by the native people. The Sara and some allied towns in the middle of Carolina were also not put on the map. So there are antagonisms in Carolina between the native peoples, and there were peoples from Carolina who did not draw other native communities on the map. So it's not one big happy native family. There's quite a bit of competition, animosity that cross boundaries of language and affiliation. So the expansion of the Indian trade is, we spend a lot of time, I think, thinking about the present and the 20th century and more recent history. There's conversations about the deeper past and contact. The centuries in the middle have received less attention. So the 18th century and 19th century for this region. These are the areas that I worked on. Nancy mentioned work at Colonial Williamsburg. And my interest has been to really try to research and articulate what was the character of the Indian trade through many of the tributary communities and close communities like the Catawba and the Cherokee, and how did this process have changed? And as an anthropologist, I am interested in history, but I'm more interested in processes and how that change unfolded over time. So trying to explain, how do we get from, we look around the room today and see what we're all wearing and how we got here in the building that we're in, how do we explain the point of contact in that early colonial period to the condition of the community today? In every community, not just this one, but multiple ones. How do we go from bark lodges to brick ranchers? And these are key centuries, talking about that process and how Native communities very much engaged the market economy, supplying thousands and thousands of deerskins out of Charleston and ports in Virginia annually in exchange for all of the goods that are pictured here. It is guns and ammunition, sure, but it's also kettles and fish hooks, replacing all that bone material we see in the museum out here with iron implements, ceramics that become made of copper, in tin, as opposed to ceramics made, the containers made from ceramics, European wools and linens replacing leathers. So we hear about roles like John Oxendine acting as a cooper in the 17th century. That's a very valuable trade in the period, to learn a trade. What goes in that cooperage, in those barrels, is tobacco and beaver exports. But that role as a tradesperson gives him coin, and he can also purchase things. So native peoples are also in the market economy using coin and credit and buying things, but it does have an impact over long periods of time because we don't make everything in the village anymore. We have to get it from outside the village. That means we have to stay engaged in the commerce. We have to take on, we would know after a period of time, no one remembers how to make the things we used to make because we can just buy them. And I think that sounds like a very contemporary narrative to our own lives right now. This was briefly mentioned, but I'll offer it again just as a running list, and hopefully we can have a conversation and we'll see a few last slides. But there's a real collapse in the demography of the region as an outcome of warfare and disease. Those two are pretty popular in terms of the historical narrative about what happened to all the native peoples. Those that are less often discussed include enslavement, and to realize that the Indian slave trade put 50,000 Indians out of the South during the 17th century. And that's a pretty significant number to take away from the demography of the native South. When you compare how many Africans were imported into all of North America, which includes Mexico, the Caribbean, the continental US, and Canada, is about 10,000 during the same time period. So 10,000 Africans in, 50,000 natives out. That's a really different kind of narrative than slavery has really been given, and it's only the past 15 or so years that scholars have been engaging Indian slavery as important to recognize that exports out of Charleston sure sent some Tuscarora to the Caribbean, but they also shipped natives out of Charleston to New England, and they were called Carolina slaves in the record for a period of time. Not saying they're from one continent or the other, but Carolina slaves indicates that they were native individuals. And that slavery took, its contours were shaped very differently. A raid by Catawbas against maybe the Creeks, back at Catawba Town, an Indian trader from Virginia could purchase or trade for a few young people and take them overland to Virginia as slaves, and they would be bound in term service for 25 years. However, if the same trader shipped them out of Charleston and they arrived in Virginia, they would be servants for life. slaves for life. That was based in the heading statutes of the laws of Virginia. So Indian slaves over land, term service. Indian slaves by port, lifelong. So it encouraged export, even if you were going a short distance, to bring them in by water. So what's the impact of the demography of a native inside the colony? I think of Pamunkey, 15, or 20% of, by say 1720 or so, 15 or 20% of the slaves imported into the Pamunkey's territory were native. So what is the impact of a native community who's free alongside a plantation owner who has both Africans, indentured servants, and a large population of Indian slaves? People work closely together, neighboring locations. People find affinity with each other based on ancestry maybe, or how they look, or even just their situation. But when they work closely together, they make new people. So the 17th century is full of American Indians in this category of servitude, but we don't know as much about from where they come. Obviously, they're not speaking their language at 8 years old. They're stripped from their communities. If they don't have anyone to converse with, the dominant language that's used by everybody is English, not the indigenous language. This wasn't the case in every colonial situation, but it's important, I think, for us to understand the impact of enslavement, both on what natives who are free think about those that are enslaved, but also the lives of those who were enslaved brought into colonial society and what choices they may have made moving forward. Coalescent communities and removal, two other categories that aren't always considered. That, the Catawba weren't known as the Catawba at the turn of the 18th century. They were sometimes called the Usheri, and they spoke 15 to 20 different languages in the Catawba towns, speaking to that complexity of coalescence, of remnant populations coming together to form a new community. So coalescence into new groups, getting names like Lumbee, or Catawba, or Cherokee, or Creek. Those are all similar processes of coalescence, even though the character of the communities may be different. The coalescence process is a reality that states make tribes, and sometimes tribes make states. So like the relationship to the colonial government solidified that all the nations that were living at Christana became known as Saponi, even though they weren't all Saponi. They were doing business at a certain point in time, because they had a treaty that identified them as that name. And a community can be stuck with a name because of politics and because of paperwork. And that's a process that continues from the period that we're talking about. I want to move quickly here because we're just out of time, and it's, yeah? Got a few minutes. Okay, all right. I'll throw a few slides up. Just like these are made by contemporary. They're not historic images, but to give you a sense of how the frontier shifted from 1700 to 1750. On the left side, you can see all the little red dots. Those are what we call Indian towns. Indian town becomes the reservation. At the time, it was just called Indian town. Sometimes it's the Pamunkey Indian town. Sometimes it's the Nottoway Indian town, the Chowan Indian town. But in 1700, there's multiple villages on the Roanoke rivers, the Tuscaroras that are down there, but these are the small Indian towns across the dismal swamp. And the times in which cities were settled. Hampton is there, Norfolk is there, Williamsburg is there. If we move 50 years in time, Tarboro and Halifax have been founded, Edenton has been founded. You see multiple European territories that have moved well past those Indian communities and surrounded them like Indian islands, if you will, in a sea of colonial expansion west. And at a point in 1750 or so, many of the communities in Carolina were simply isolated and cut off from other groups. So you deal with those people that are closest to you. You can move, you can get up. So when times like the French and Indian War come, we see lots of native peoples mobilizing to become part of the story again in some sort of way, to re-engage their relationship as former tributaries. So I think it's exciting to see the Tuscarora, Meherrin, Saponi come together and say, yes, we will fight on behalf of the Crown, go out into the West, and they fight in theaters that are now in Pennsylvania and Ohio, and receive accolades for their service during the French and Indian War. And because of some of those connections made, some Tuscaroras elect to leave this region again in the 1760s. Because of some of those connections that were made with those other Iroquois in the north. Nottoways, Chowans, Meherrins, they also leave at some point along with them. Not everybody leaves, but it's, I think, important to recognize that coalescence and removal are also similar solutions removal is a solution that some people take. And so moving into a place like Drowning Creek to get away from individual activities or systems or structures is a process that's not unlike moving to New York or farther west. It's a process that humans have done multiple times. And it's a very indigenous thing to go to the swamp. We see multiple locations where native communities in the historical record will build forts and will go to the swamp as a place of refuge. And so we can look for some of those Indian towns that you see have a close proximity to waterways and swamps and to fortifications that they can use. The Great Dismal, it's no mistake that this map is sort of scattered around the Great Dismal, the Assamusic, and other places, not unlike the phenomenon we see down here in southeastern Carolina. So that's a little bit about removal and coalescence. I don't know if we made a copy of this map for the folders or not. I think I sent one to you, but it's one community's storyline. It's the Saponi and Tutelo and their movements through the Virginia Carolinas in the 18th century, but the stretch of Saponi experience that goes into Ontario and into New York and part of Pennsylvania. And of course some people's, this is mostly the 1740 migration, but we know from the historical record, as was mentioned earlier with Colonel Eaton's land, Saponi stayed in Carolina. We have some records of them in Virginia in the 1760s and 70s. It's a scant reference, but there are Saponis that stayed. So not all Saponis are in one place all the time. I think is a good idea. Not all Chirraws are in the same place at the same time. Not all Nottaways or Wyanokes are in the same place at the same time. And in fact, we can find them divided up in multiple communities. So there's some Wayanoke at Nansemond, Chowan, Nottaway, Tuscarora, and with the Shakori. So they're all Wayanoke, but they're all scattered in different locales and different locations. So I'll conclude with this slide. It's a nice bring around to Colonial Williamsburg's mentioned earlier in the American Indian Initiative. It's a portrait of contemporary Native peoples portraying the historical past. They're in the market economy. I wouldn't say they're particularly dressed like Indians that most people expect to see, but it is that middle century, an explanation and interpretation of the material culture and changes and life ways that people who stayed inside the colony's boundaries underwent. And it demonstrates some continuity from the deeper past, and I think it's an area that's really important for Genealogical Symposium to consider, that just because members of the market economy may look white, or they may be called servant or slave, doesn't necessarily mean they fit those racialized categories that we've been forced to believe. And there's a lot of Native people in those categories. Thank you very much. Maybe a couple of questions and then we can break.
Before we take questions, can you tell us a little bit about the Jamestown TV show that you work on, so we can look at some more of your work?
Okay, right, so, you know, as an anthropologist, I do similar jobs for different entities. So sometimes it's a museum, sometimes it's a tribe, sometimes it's a TV show or a film. It's usually about doing cultural interpretation, research, bringing people together from disparate parts that, you know, don't always see each other, they don't always work together well. So for Jamestown, I've been working some with the Pamunkey, but lots of other Native communities too, to help with their background casting and to advise the writers on some of the Native content. I saw an opportunity because there was funding, because it was a television show, and I mean, not just for me, I saw an opportunity to maybe do some work. So language is always important to communities, more so today I think than maybe in the decades past. But I saw a chance to further some research in linguistics, and I made the case to the Jamestown producers. They produce Downton Abbey, they're called Carnival Films, NBC Universal's their parent company, to do linguistic work. And they agreed for us to hire a native speaker as well as historical linguist. And so the three of us work as a little team to work on Algonquian. And I've been so excited about the success that we've had. Season 1's okay, but by the time we get to season 3, we've got some really good Algonquian speakers, and they sound really good. One of our collaborators does work in Alberta and Saskatchewan with Cree speakers, and so for fun, we play some of the Jamestown dialogue to see what the Cree, because it's semi-mutually intelligible, and the Crees have a good time listening to that coastal Algonquin, and they're like, oh yeah, they know what they're saying, and they laugh about it. But the exciting part is that we've brought this language back, at least for television, from its dormancy. So it was sleeping for a long time. It hasn't been spoken fluently for 150 years. And while it is a TV production, it's ready for community members to engage. We've spent a lot of time and effort in working on the language and organizing it. So my role has been part of the language. It's also been about cultural background, casting, working with wardrobe, props, sets, and the writers. And is it all great and perfect? No, it's not, because it's a negotiation. It is theater. So Hollywood, even from Great Britain, they want certain things, and sometimes we have to negotiate on set about appropriate actions, or that's not the right kind of animal, or we didn't have any of those in Virginia. It said antlers. I'm like, yeah, but we didn't have those antlers.
Can you tell us where Virginia is, where you all filmed?
We're filming in Budapest, Hungary. So it has a similar environment. The labor is less expensive than in England or in Virginia. And because there are some other workers and people there that can do some of the other kinds of work, they put out the call for locations, and Hungary won financially. So what an adventure, taking 45 natives from North America to Budapest. And we have, we're proud to say we have some Lumbee representation, Lumbee Tuscarora representation in the group. We also have some Six Nations representation. Some actual Pamunkeys are part of it, Chickahominys, but also folks from Lakota and Laguna and Navajo. It's a continent-wide casting. But
It's a big celebrity.
Raul Trujillo plays Opechancanough, Kalani Kepo plays Shakro, and it gets more native content we did such a great job. It gets more native content as the seasons move from 2 into 3. Season 1's on PBS right now, so if you can work through it. It is a soap opera. It's a drama, but great opportunities for young people to come be a part of a project and to see a little bit of the world. And I think a great opportunity for some cultural representation, and to try to do as best we can in terms of visuals for consumption.
Hey, questions? This is amazing information, what you shared today.
All right. Yes, sir. Here in the front, Mr. Schwartz.
Okay. The Carolina-Virginia line. When they say Roanoke, what do you consider Roanoke? Is it in Carolina or is it in Virginia?
Well, the island's in Carolina, but the Virginians didn't really think Roanoke was part of Carolina for a pretty long time, because the river does go into Virginia.
Now, Pasquotank County was, you studying?
Pasquotank County it was the Albemarle Precinct for a while. It was part of Virginia, and then it was transferred to Carolina in the colonial period.
Yeah.
But it started as Virginia.
Yeah, you had quite a few Lowrys in that Pasquotank, as you know. Yeah, and of course, when you talk about Roanoke, a lot of the history from the Lumbees is that that's where they came from.
So there's quite a few, genealogical connections that go back into the Virginia and northeastern Carolina regions that we're talking about, and that's why I think Nancy thought sort of unpacking some of the processes of colonialism and what happens inside the borders in terms of people's interactions and relationships. I've looked very closely at the Chowan and the Nottoway and Pamunkey and Nansemond and many of the groups working inside the communities, inside the colonial boundaries, and I think those are some really productive avenues for people to consider. The Bass family from the Nansemond, for instance, do have relationships to the Halawassaponi genealogy, but the Basses, they're not acting like Indians in the way that people think about it, but they're native peoples, and they buy land, and they marry each other a lot. They do. Yeah.
Yes, ma'am.
My question is, the Dark Ages and leading up to the Golden Age. I was a friend of mine, his name's Nick Locklear, we've been talking about the Dark Age and going into the Golden Age. And his theory is that they were broken, busted, and disgusted over there, and they came over here, and they found the resources here, and that led them into the Golden Age period. I wanted to find out your
So the impetus and why Europeans came,
Yeah.
or why the English came?
Yes, sir.
Well, the world system that we live in right now started 500 years ago. So we're still in the same system. There was competition among Europeans for resources. And England was kind of late to the game. Spain was definitely more heavily engaged. So it started off not as England, like a country doing it, but rather entrepreneurs. Almost all of the English colonies are private to begin with. They're merchants. So there's, the capitalist system that we know has its antecedents at this point in time. So there's a capitalist, a young capitalist, early form of capitalism, a merchant who's looking for opportunity for resources. So the Lost Colony, quotes, was founded, Raleigh has that as a private company. The Jamestown Company is private. The New England Company is private. And eventually, once they become settled, or at least secure, the Crown will try to take over those ventures and made Virginia, for instance, a royal colony. There's a competition between the crowns of Europe and the merchant class. And an example of it, the King of England gets rid of Parliament, which is mostly the electoral representative government of the merchants. He dismisses Parliament, rules without Parliament for 15 years or so. And the turmoil in England really is playing out in the Americas. That middle period of the 17th century English civil wars do have a relationship to some of the warfare and conflict that takes place in the Virginia Carolinas. I think competition is probably the short answer for you. I mean, in competition within early forms of capitalism for resources, and Native peoples enter into that system at that same time and become participants and agents, just as others do. And the relationship with any relationship with a capitalist is a capitalist relationship. That's the nature of capitalism. So we inherited that system. It changed, but those are the impetuses and reasons, I think, for expansion into this region. Yes, ma'am.
I wanted to ask a question about why do they call us Native people, nations of people, Indian? Is that the name that was adopted from Columbus?
So there's most
500 years
right. So most people, attribute it to two things. One, that they originally thought they were coming to the Indies, and so they called, the Indies, people of the Indies, the Indians. Another idea says that it deals from Indios, which is in God, that these are natural peoples that are closer to the Garden of Eden, and peoples that are uncorrupted by emerging, civilization and industrialism. That they're Indios, they're in with God. That's in Spanish. I think it sticks from the Indies. They change it to the West Indies and East Indies, and but they use all kinds of other words in the record too. That one just sort of won out long term. They use naturals. They talk about them as Virginians. That's just what they call them. We're schooling 20 of the Virginians right now, is what they say in the record. They talk about them in terms of sauvage. They talk about the Irish as being sauvage and the French as being sauvage, and these are sauvages over here. Savage being like ruffians, backwoods people, unrefined individuals. We have a negative connotation of the word today, but in the period it was, they were trying to describe the naturals in relationship to themselves. But the fact they called them kings and queens, I think, also means that they were kind of working that out a little bit, right? The kings and queens of Virginia.
And Miko's and Turkey.
And later, Miko's and other kinds of terms, widowances and so forth. Yes, sir.
Yeah, so we know that in doing our genealogy and things, that we do see families that come out of Virginia. And so a lot of times I think people get confused, even myself, as why do you think we're bringing those families down from Virginia coming into Carolina?
Opportunity. And opportunity, the competition's pretty stiff inside the colony in an area that land, if we go back to those earlier slides, where land is being commodified and organized in plantation structures. someone's free, becomes free, maybe from servitude. Someone's looking for opportunity, whether they're Irish or Scottish. I mean, it's really no mistake that most of the sort of the mercantile arm of the English colony are Scotsmen. So they're tributary people too, and they're looking for opportunities. So, you know, how do you end up with so many Scottish names among the Muskogee? McIntosh, McQueen, McGillivray, we just make a long list, but all those Scottish names come from those merchants who were heading out onto the frontier to do business. So I could see that there's a lot of other people who are looking for opportunities too, whether to come out of Virginia into an area that can be settled for farming, part of the native trade, part of the Indian trade, outside of colonial oversight could be a reason. You know, the farther I get away from that outfit in terms of servitude, maybe I won't be known by my neighbors in the same condition that I was known when I was there. A new settlement that has you know, been heard about in a location. There's new land being opened up. In 1705, they opened up the Blackwater, which was, prior to that time, restricted from colony settlement. It was restricted territory. But when they lifted the Blackwater line, there were already a few people over the line. Possibly some of your ancestors were some of those communities coming into Pasquotank and Albemarle and places like that where they weren't supposed to be specifically, but they were already there. They lifted the Blackwater line. Many communities, you know, members moved into that territory to patent lands and to create new plantations and to create new structures, which had an impact possibly of pushing those individuals just inside the line, such as the Weyanoke, or the Nottoway, or Saponis, or the Basses for that matter, farther into Carolina as they became in competition with other, I wouldn't say Europeans, but other colonial Virginians who are moving into that space. So it's not an isolated phenomenon. The Western movement of peoples is part of that colonial story and then American story of the early republic.
Land grants. Lots of land grants.
Yeah, one thing we talked about last night, you know, so how do you pay for a revolutionary soldier when you have no money in the bank? You give them land. So the land grants in the Ohio for people who served in the military, I mean, I records where there's, you know, Pamunkeys getting land grants and all kind of, you know, Nottoways getting land grants. They don't take the land grants in the Ohio, they sell them, but that's what they were giving people land taken from native peoples, surveyed by the College of William and Mary's surveyors, but they were, you know, putting people into that territory. And we talk about the Trailatiers, but all my Shawnee and Wyandotte friends like to remind people that there's another Trailatiers out of the old northwest of Ohio and Indiana and Illinois, and the native peoples, Delawares, were pushed out of there and removed from there, partially as an outcome of that land grant for the Revolution and the War of 1812. And it's also how so many Virginians or Carolinians end up in the Ohio's and out in that area, because they were served here and they went out there for opportunity.
All right.
Time for
Sounds
break.
like a good wrapping up point.
Okay. Thanks so much.
Thank you so much.